Good afternoon, everybody. Happy to see you all here. Welcome to our monthly Brown Bag lecture series. My name is Linda Van Ingen. I'm chair of the history department at UNK. And we co-host and collaborate on this series with the Kearney Public Library. So we always like to thank our co-sponsors from the library. If you could all give a round of applause for all the help we get from the library. Really appreciate it. And I was thinking as I was coming in that a lot of our UNK history graduates work in the library. So when you come to the library and you are talking to one of the librarians or one of the resource people or somebody at the circulation desk, ask them what their major was and where they went to school, and they'll say, oh, I was a history major at UNK. So it just gives you a good insight as to what you can do with a history degree. Before I introduce our lecturer today, I want to just mention, and I'm supposed to be turning these slides over here too, our upcoming talks. So, I want to echo this. Our next talk in August, we're the second Wednesday of each month, I believe. Second Wednesday of each month. Our August talk will be Dr. Will Stoudemeyer from our department. Searching for Eliza, Myth, Memory, and the History at the Frank Museum. This is going to be a really interesting talk. He's done some really great discovery research on an African American woman who worked at the Frank Museum. And then in September, we have Dr. David Vale, who's in our audience today. He's also from the History Department, professor, and he is going to talk on conservation, civil defense, natural disasters, and agriculture in the Cold War Great Plains, and this is coming from a book that he's working on, his second book. Our speaker today, and I know this microphone's a little echoey. Look at all these great slides. Our speaker today is going to speak on the stratospheric rise and explosive fall of the Explorer 1 balloon. It's a mouthful, and I'd encourage you all to all say that out loud at some other time. But our speaker today is Dr. Nathan Tye. He's an assistant professor, just promoted to associate professor at UNK, where he has taught since 2019. He earned his PhD in history from the University of Illinois Champaign, Urbana. He's an avid local historian. He serves on the boards of several local community museums and cultural organizations. He can be found digging through boxes in the archives at the Trails and Rails Museum, and really that's one of his favorite things to do, is to go to archives anywhere in the state of Nebraska. And he's just got this expert touch in finding novelties that have been buried in the archives for generations, and then he brings them to light. So really excited about his talk today. Please welcome Dr. Nathan Tye.
Can everybody hear me? Good. Okay. Thank you, Linda, for the wonderful introduction. And as always, as the convener of this series, I want to thank Christy Walsh and the entirety of the Kearney Public Library for providing the space, the support, and the opportunity to share the work that we're doing at UNK with ourselves, our students, as well as visiting faculty and other historians from across the state and across the region. This talk is also something that I have to thank, because she is in the room, Director April White from the G.W. Frank Museum. This entire talk got started, this long research project, because we have, as you'll see, two photos of this crash at the G.W. Frank Museum, which is exactly where two photos of a 1930s high atmospheric balloon crash should be. Is it a Victorian house museum? But we'll talk about why that is. So I want to thank the G.W. Frank Museum, as well as the Nebraska Prairie Museum in Holdridge, which is the closest museum to the crash site, has the largest amount of material, and has been cultivating the story since their inception. And so we'll see some of that. But we need to begin. We need to get into the air. A live radio broadcast brought hundreds of curious residents from across Phelps County and towns nearby to Reuben Johnson's cornfield outside Loomis on July 28, 1934. High above, a small white dot, which you can begin to see descending here, named Explorer grew larger as calm voices on the radio offered updates on the dot's descent. Quote, little other talking was done, recalled Captain Albert Stevens, for our ears were strained to get warning sounds from above us. Every sound could mean a new tear or growing rip in their high altitude balloon. As the tear grew and fears of a crash rose, the trio gathered their parachutes and prepared to jump. Quote, nothing could be done to land it statically and it could fail as a parachute at any time. Accordingly, I gave the order for each member to get out into their position preparatory for individual parachute jumps, recalled Major Willa Cather, the leader of the expedition. As they ready to jump, the hydrogen-oxygen mixture in their envelope exploded. All three leapt to safety. Kepner remembered, I watched the balloon bag as it flashed by and hit the ground almost immediately. I would estimate about 150 below where my parachute opened. It was close, and this is actually it hitting the ground in Loomis. There's an Army Air Corps spotter plane that is trailing and taking photos as the I guess at this point, large explosive metal object detonates in the cornfield, and you can see the little white dots. Those are the parachutes with the crew, who have just barely made it away. The gondola slammed into Johnson's Field and shattered. An Army airplane photographed the crash and the three parachutes as they're descending. And after looking over the wreckage, Major Kepner walked a half mile to the nearest farmhouse, seen here as well, and the family let him borrow their phone so that he could inform the Army Air Corps that they had all survived, but that the balloon had not. Before I had a chance to hang up the receiver, he recalls, a voice broke in from telephone headquarters saying, Major Kepner, hold on where you are. We're going to put you on a national radio broadcast and request that you tell the story so all can hear. In a few minutes, I was broadcasting from a Nebraska farmhouse over NBC the story of our flight and that all three crewmen had jumped to safety. And that crash site soon became, these are the photos from the G.W. Frank Museum, this crash site very quickly became a spot of curiosity for everybody in the local area to descend upon. And you can actually see there's also some film recorders. There's folks with cameras who are documenting the site for later newsreel coverage. And the crew is just kind of anxiously trying to figure out where everything ended up in this field. So it's quite a curiosity that this even happened. But why should we care? Little remembered today, the Explorer flights, both Explorer 1 and its much more successful successor, Explorer 2, were instrumental efforts in the United States aviation history and the long effort to reach space. Encapsulated in a state-of-the-art Dow metal gondola filled with scientific instruments and radio equipment, Major William Kepner, Captain Orville Anderson, and Captain Albert Stevens hoped to obtain unprecedented heights in human aviation. Sponsored by the National Geographic Society and the United States Army Air Corps, the Explorer aimed to be the first successful stratospheric flight in United States history. It was a leap into the nascent space race, an international drive for higher and higher balloon flights by the United States, the Soviet Union, and independent French aviators, among others, which demonstrated that humans could reach the stratosphere and beyond. Other balloonists had made it, but had died in the process. This history is a key moment in the development of human aviation. As historian David Dvorkin argues, the forces that led the United States to promote manned balloon flights in the 1930s were not unlike those responsible for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, Project Apollo in the 1960s. International competition played an important role in each period, a natural consequence of over a century of sporting competition between nations for speed, duration, and altitude that drove balloon technologies. Now, the historian John Scribner makes a similar case about these expeditions, saying that they were unique and it was more scientifically oriented to the exploration of space for future activity than previous attempts elsewhere in the world. This expedition hoped to prove that humans could survive in the stratosphere, and passage through the stratosphere is required to get to space. If we were to find out we couldn't make it that high, the space race was over then and there. But before we get there, and I am not a scientist, so I cannot explain to you the stratosphere. So we are going to let history explain that with a British newsreel that explains the stratosphere.
The eyes of science and aviation are on the new cult of stratosphere ballooning. But just what is the stratosphere? Well, we'll tell you. The Earth is enveloped in a sea of air which we call atmosphere. The higher one goes, the colder it becomes. Viewing the Earth from this angle, we see the atmosphere divided into several well-defined layers. The innermost of these is called the troposphere. It's the air in which we live. Above the troposphere is the stratosphere, a much thinner mixture. The troposphere reaches to a height of 6 to 10 miles. Mount Everest, the very top of our Earth world, rises 5.5 miles above sea level, more than halfway to the stratosphere. Now, the troposphere is constantly in motion due to its proximity to the Earth's surface. But above, in the stratosphere, there are neither storms, winds, ice, rain, or fog. Silence reigns eternally in the icy coldness of 70 degrees below zero. The sun and stars shine brightly in a purplish-black sky. From the vast space between the stars far above the stratosphere come the cosmic rays, which are believed to be the key to the creation of matter. To study them, experimenters have fitted their laboratories into giant balloons. Endeavoring to get above the Earth's storms and disturbances, they rise into the void of perpetual calm and quiet in order to study what is over and beyond. The highest an aeroplane has ever flown is 8.5 miles. But in 1932, Professor Pickard made the first scientific flight, achieving a height of 10.1 miles. In 1933, Settle and Ford, near the United States Army, rose to an altitude of 11.5 miles, obtaining more valuable data. Soviet airmen then broke the record and attained a height of 11.8 miles. There is a limit to which 3 balloons can ascend, so perhaps the future of stratosphere exploration lies in the rocket type of ship, and there's no telling what wonders will be discovered. It has been proved that stratosphere flying is practical. Aeroplanes will be able to shake off the resistance of dense, heavy airs as they rise higher into the stratosphere and reach 500 miles an hour. Commerce will then be able to speed from America to Europe overnight.
So what that very nice British gentleman tells us is the stratosphere is the highest level of the atmosphere, and there's an effort to reach these heights, both in scientific exploration, but also the commercial applications. None of you, I don't know if you've really ever considered this, a great many of us in this room have been in the stratosphere. Most long distance aviation, today commercial aviation, gets into what is the stratosphere to ease travel as they talk about here, but in this time period, it is so far away that they're like, well, we need rockets to get up that high. And now it's like, well, you can just hop on a plane and get up that high. But there have been a number of previous attempts, and they talk about this, and this is the series of expeditions that have gotten there. Mentions Picard, the French aviator who reaches, the first to kind of reach into the upper echelon of the stratosphere. There is a Navy expedition that gets quite high, and then the Explorer one that we're going to talk about, which is an attempt to get over 75,000, but ends up in Loomis, and then its successor, the Explorer 2. But this is a dangerous endeavor. In 1927, the Army Air Corps established its highest altitude record at that point, 43,000 feet over Illinois, but Hawthorne Gray, the balloonist, died in the descent. And he was in a balloon with an open basket and a mask. They didn't find him until the next day. And among the crew who found him was Major William Kepner, the leader then of the Explorer balloon. All future expeditions, kind of understanding that an open gondola was not the way to go, would travel in metal gondolas with their own oxygen systems, which Auguste Piccard, the French balloonist, who was the first to go above 50,000 feet in 1931 and 1932, and then the Navy expedition, which hit 60,000 feet, reached in 1933. Now, this is also a race. The Soviet Union is also attempting to reach unprecedented heights. They reached 63,000 feet in 1933, but in 1934, the Soviet expedition does reach 72,000 feet, but none of the balloonists return alive. Their balloon does crash, killing all of them. And so this is something that is a very dangerous endeavor on both sides kind of this early balloon race. And into this race in the mid-1930s, 1930, steps the Army Air Corps. And they give a variety of reasons. One, they're very, very interested. In this time period, what becomes the Air Force is part of the United States Army. There's also a competition with the Navy. They want to go above the Navy's expedition. But they also have a very clear scientific aim that they want. And so they solicit sponsorship from the National Geographic Society to help pay for the construction of the balloon and the construction of the gondola, as well as the scientific equipment. The National Geographic Society agrees. They will publish the research, the photos, as well as any accounts of the expedition, whereas the Army Air Corps is providing the pilots and the ground crew necessary for a successful launch. And that crew is pictured here. They pictured 3 kind of seasoned Army Air Corps officers, Major William Kepner, who is the commander of the flight. It's kind of confusing. He's the one in the middle. And he's actually a former instructor from the Omaha Balloon School. So Fort Omaha, located in North Omaha now, the campus for the Metropolitan Community College was a balloon school during the First World War where he had taught. He also is accompanied by Captain Albert Stevens, the expedition science officer, and a world leader in aerial photography. He's probably the greatest aerial photographer at this time period. He's at Wright. He also has the world parachute record at this point in time. He completed and survived a jump from 24,000 feet. He was tasked with supervising the scientific experiments. They were going to look at cosmic rays, the ozone layer, and then the impact of high altitude flight on the human body. As the newsreel tells us, it's 60 below zero when you get up to these heights, and there's very little protection from cosmic radiation on the body. But he was not an experienced balloonist, experienced parachutist, which is going to be very helpful, but not an experienced balloonist. So they add Captain Orville Anderson at left, who was the operations officer. He supervised the inflation and the launch of the balloon, and then was added at a last minute to help with all the other tasks that they believed the expedition was going to require. Now, the balloon that they built is a state-of-the-art device. This is the largest balloon up to this point in time. It's going to be 3 times as large as any previous balloon. It's got a cubic volume of 3 million cubic feet. The balloon is made of rubberized cotton of different thicknesses across the balloon itself, and then it requires 2 1/3 acres of fabric. It is an enormous endeavor to make this instrument, and it required 5 months to produce this, with the creation of the textile, the rubberization of the textile, and Goodyear Zeppelin makes this balloon for them. They also then turn to Dow for the gondola, which is made of Dow metal. It's a magnesium alloy. It's lighter than steel and aluminum. It has 10 portholes, and is really a kind of state-of-the-art, so much so that they advertise with this. The gondola itself only weighs 700 pounds. Can fit 3 men, and has 10 portholes kind of put of different sizes kind of through the gondola, but it is not insulated. So they have to wear heavy flight suits, and they also fill it full of thousands and thousands of pounds of scientific equipment. This is the inside, and so you have 3 men in this very cramped space with all of this heavy-duty scientific equipment, heavy batteries, given the time period to provide for this, radio equipment as well. So it's very, very cramped. It's very, very loud. They all wear headsets with microphones when they're inside, so they can communicate with one another. And it becomes, as Kepner recalls, it becomes a floating laboratory as they go further and further up. But if you've got a state-of-the-art balloon, you've got a state-of-the-art gondola, but where are you going to launch this thing? And they look all over. They need a very particular type of launch site. There's not enough money. This is early in the Depression, right? This is 1933, 1934 as they're developing this. There's not a lot of money to build a very weird-looking building so that you can inflate the balloon and not have crosswinds that would interfere. So they're looking for a natural formation, a natural launch site. And they look all over the American West, and they're traveling. They look at meteor crater in Arizona, but then determine that this is not, that a meteorite crater is not adequate because they'd have to build roads. They go to Wyoming, and as the story goes, the crew was illegally hunting, and the sheriff found out, so they decided not to. They were shooting grouse out of season, so they decided not to do that. They did look at North Platte, and chose not to do that. But then they find the Stratobowl, what becomes the Stratobowl. It's a natural indentation in the Black Hills. It's southwest of Rapid City. And the way that the geography is laid out, that they can actually inflate the balloon completely, and it is blocked from any crosswinds from the valley. And so the city of Rapid City offers to provide whatever they can do. They're going to build a road out there. They're going to provide spaces. They actually move a large portion of the manpower from Fort Meade to build this facility. And there's also a really nice trout creek that runs through it. So the crew are very excited that in their downtime they can do some fishing. And so they build, functionally, a military base at the base of this bowl, where they have thousands of hydrogen canisters that they're going to need to inflate. They build a hospital. They build 2 radio studios. They have barracks for the crews that need to come in and kind of handle the balloon, and everything that they are going to need to have a successful launch. And it also brings curious visitors. It's in the press a lot. People on their summer vacations go up here. And there's a young woman by the name of Florence Yoder, who's a teacher from Elm Creek, who goes to visit the launch site, and as we'll see, she appears again. They're prepared for launch. They have everything ready. They just have to wait for the right weather conditions. This isn't something you can just launch on any day. And they find it. They see a high pressure system coming in, and so they begin to inflate on July 27th. And into the night, they begin their preparations, and a little after 5 a.m., they make the final things they need to do. They add a bag of airmail that they can bring up with them. They put in their flight suits. They have very thick flight suits that they're going to wear. We'll also see what happens with those. And then they put in, very importantly, 3 parachutes. And then at about 5:54, the order is given to cast off, as Albert Stevens talks about. And below us, the ground dropped rapidly away, and the explorers swept over the rim of our camp in a direction eastward towards Omaha. And they see, as he talks about here, that there are thousands of people who have come through the night that are ringing the canyon to watch them ascend into the upper atmosphere. And the flight goes fairly well from the beginning. They put on their heavy flight suits as it gets colder. They don their radio helmets, and all of this is being broadcast live via NBC. So what is going on in the cabin, everybody around the nation is listening to. They are captivated by this. Again, this is 1934. We're in the middle of the Depression. There's not a lot to be happy about. And the possibility that we're going to achieve new heights, we're going to beat the Soviets, there's a good feeling for a lot of people. At about 11:40, they note that the Niobrara River is north of them, that they have begun moving south into Nebraska, and they begin to ascend to 57,000 feet. And there are airplanes that are following them until the airplanes are unable to reach the same heights. And so we have here, and it's really difficult to see that white dot at the very top, is the airplanes have hit their upper limit, and the 3 men in the gondola keep going up and up and up. And things are going really, really well until they hit 60,613 feet, or 11.5 miles in altitude, when suddenly there's a shudder and a tear in the envelope. And these are all trained pilots, experienced balloonists, and they remain very, very calm. But then they look up, and they see that they are beginning to drop, and that a tear has formed in the envelope, and that they are dropping fairly rapidly. And they begin to drop to the point where the airplanes can see them again. And so you can see the tear that has formed in the envelope. And they are calm. They can still land this. The balloon is now increasingly functioning as a parachute. And as long as oxygen does not begin mixing with the hydrogen, and as long as the tear does not expand, they can still land safely. They want to preserve, they have achieved a substantial height, they have scientific equipment aboard, they want to be able to retrieve the data and the equipment, and they also want to survive. Okay. And they begin taking measures to slow their descent. The crew understood that if they didn't maintain a steady descent, they would die. The downward speed would be so great, one of the crew recalled, that we could scarcely expect to push through the rush of air across the hatch openings. If they went any faster, the G-forces they wouldn't be able to get out. And this is what happened to the Soviet crew that they are very well aware of. As they descended, the rip began moving up the envelope. But the crew remained calm. They also had a parachute on the gondola itself, so there were safety measures. This was, a state-of-the-art expedition. And again, all of this is being broadcast live across the nation. Once they descended about 18,000 feet, the crew actually gets out onto the top of the gondola, and they begin to look to see what's going on above them. They need to be able to ascertain how bad things are. And as Major Kepner remembers, it was a grand feeling to be outside where we could, if necessary, use our individual parachutes. We were no longer in a trap, we were free. So there was some safety, there was some possibility. And they eventually get down to about 5,000 feet as they continue south across Nebraska. Then at 4,000 feet, the entire bottom gives way, and that's this photo here, right? Where the bottom of the balloon just actually drapes over the gondola. And they also then notice that air is rushing into the hydrogen envelope. And as America is going to see in 3 years later with the Hindenburg explosion, this is not a good chemical interaction. This is not something that they want to see. As Kepner recalled, in this condition, it was nothing more than a parachute with a load of 6,000 pounds that was liable to explode. Then at 4,000, as they keep going down, that they realize that nothing can be done to land it statically, that they were in a very dangerous position. So Kepner gives the order for all three of the men to prepare for their parachutes. They also cut the spectrograph, which is dangling below the balloon. It ends up being the only experiment to survive because it's on its own parachute, and they do eventually find it. As they prepared, and they don't know who, they don't really remember, but one of them steps on one of the parachute cords, and the parachute goes off in the gondola. And it was Captain Anderson's parachute. And so Captain Anderson bundles up his parachute, he's holding it, and he gets up out on top, and he's debating with the major about what they should do to how can he survive? Can I just throw it out and hopefully it opens up? What's going on? As they're having this disagreement, the balloon detonates. And so then it's not really a matter of kind of debate. So Anderson just heaves the parachute out, and thankfully it opens up, and he lands safely. Meanwhile, Kepner's still in the gondola, and Stevens he's trying to jump out a side porthole, and he's having some issues. He tries to jump once, he tries to jump a second time, doesn't really quite do it, so Kepner actually kicks him out the porthole, and he also lands safely. And then Kepner, the captain of the expedition, the leader of the expedition, he is the last to jump. And the gondola, again, seen here, is about to crash into the field. The gondola slammed in the field ahead of the men, and the spotter aircraft photographed their jump and the crash. The three landed around their crumpled aircraft, and then because people had been listening on the radio, very, very quickly people are appearing at the crash site. And coincidentally, among them is Florence Yoder, the Elm Creek teacher who had actually gone to the Stratus Bowl a couple of weeks earlier. So she's one of the few people who was both at the launch and the crash. After looking over the record, as the speech opened, Kepner walks a half mile to the nearest farmhouse. The farm, lets him call the Army Air Corps and let him know what happens. And this, even in and of itself, is enough of a scientific novelty that they actually, National Geographic publishes the radio diagram on how they wired up the radio at the farmhouse, and then were able to broadcast the radio message across the United States. So even the fact that he gets off the plane, gets on the phone, and suddenly is broadcasting live on NBC is enough in this kind of technological era of worthy of scientific interest. At least one of the chase planes then lands in the field, so there's Army Air Corps staff very quickly on the ground trying to gain control of the scene. But as this photo demonstrates, it's a little chaotic. This is Captain Anderson. This is the Hastings Tribune. Captain Anderson, they're all in flight suits, right? They're prepared for -60 temperatures, and they suddenly land in a Nebraska cornfield at the end of July. So the temperature distinction is quite significant. And so Captain Anderson crawls into a car to change, and that very, very, kind of, I don't know, embarrassing moment is captured by the Hastings Tribune. He looks a little, he's just jumped out of an exploding balloon, and there's a reporter in his face with a phone. And thankfully, he has his long underwear under his arm. But it is a chaotic scene, and you can actually see the spotter plane is also behind him that has landed in the cornfield. And so the National Geographic actually talks about this. The crew that they are, they have just landed. Their years of effort has just exploded and detonated in a field, and they have to manage the cleanup immediately because people are taking things. They are taking pieces of the gondola. They are taking pieces of the envelope. They are taking their equipment. And stuff has spread. Like it has hit the field with an incredible amount of force, and then wreckage has strewn over a small area. And so they try to control as much as they can the gawkers and the souvenir hunters, if you will. And then again, these are the photos from the G.W. Frank Museum, which more likely than not taken either by A.T. Anderson or Mim Warlock, one of the two, came on site. Kearney photographers who because of the news appeared, and you can see just the sheer scale of the wreckage. And this is 3 1/3 acres of fabric. This is 600 pounds. This is a gondola. This is tons of scientific equipment that had impacted into this field and are all gone. Radio equipment, batteries, other kinds of things that have just imploded, and the gondola itself. And so as the locals are stripping this for souvenirs, the Army Air Corps and local law enforcement try to bring some control to the situation. Military trucks are very quickly brought out. Everything is loaded on trucks and shipped immediately to the National Geographic headquarters in Washington, D.C., where the wreckage can be recreated and there can be an investigation about what exactly happened. And it is such a international and national story that shortly thereafter, Katharine Hepburn deplanes in Omaha on a transcontinental flight, and she's flying incognito. But somehow it is found out that Katharine Hepburn is on this flight into Omaha, and they don't ask her about being Katharine Hepburn, they ask her if she saw the balloon. And she did. She's like, yeah, I saw the balloon. I don't know where, but I saw the balloon. Like, okay, you've just discovered Katharine Hepburn flying incognito across the country, and your big question is, did you see the balloon? So other stories get the balloon treatment. This becomes something. And the Army is very concerned by the amount of stuff that has been taken and that has been stolen from the crash site. So they enlist the local press to provide a call to return anything that might have been taken. And the Kearney Hub actually leads this effort as the largest newspaper in the area. These are all from the Kearney Hub from early August, where the Army and the National Geographic are increasingly saying, please, whatever you took, we want it back. No questions asked. Send it to the National Geographic Society, take it to the Hub itself. And you can take it down to the Hub office, and they will, ship it back to the National Geographic Society. And all the local papers are running this. And by and large, people do return stuff, except for Frank Rausch, a local Kearney dentist, who kept one of the gondola hatches. And this ended up, this is at the state, this is at History of Nebraska, and this is in their collection. And he donated it directly to them. It did not end up with the Army Air Corps. The greatest amount of material locally that survives from the crash is actually at the Holdridge Museum, at the museum, Nebraska Prairie Museum in Holdridge, where they have large portions of the envelope. This is the rubberized cotton fabric that was used, and then bottles and bottles of the steel buckshot that they used as ballast. Because as you can imagine, they have large ballast bags around the outside of the balloon that they are dropping as they need to attain buoyancy. And you have probably billions of tiny little stainless steel balls that have dropped all around this cornfield. And people were selecting them. And among the many treasures that are at the Nebraska Prairie Museum related to this is actually a thank you note from Captain Stevens that discusses how people are returning things via the Kearney Hub. So he writes a letter to a local woman in Holdridge. People who have taken things send things back to National Geographic. They conduct an investigation, and then non-vital materials are actually sent back. So a lot of people do end up getting pieces, and so this is how Holdridge has quite a bit of material. They don't send back big parts. This is not turned in. But they do send back pieces of the balloon, buckshot, other kinds of things that people might want. And in this, Captain Stevens says, I really want to thank the Kearney Hub, who has been facilitating the return of much of the wreckage. It says, as one of the person who had to jump from the gondola, I take the opportunity to thank you for supporting this effort to have this investigation. And so this is also, a really interesting document. And I mean, this man has survived this crash and is writing an individual letter to thank somebody for turning in a piece of the envelope. So there's kind of a community aspect that everybody is participating in this scientific endeavor through the providing of wreckage. Now, the largest collection of wreckage is actually at the National Museum of the Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. And so this is where the surviving portions of the gondola and other kind of scientific instruments from the expedition remain to this day. The kind of documenting, again, this step by the Army Air Corps to reach these unprecedented heights. Now, there is an investigation, and it is ultimately determined that the balloon froze at the high altitudes, and as the balloon then expanded, cracks formed, causing the tear. So there were efforts to redesign the balloon so that in future expeditions, this type of freezing and breakage could be accounted for. That because of the temperatures and the conditions, and as we're about to see, that they are ultimately successful. Now, all this international press coverage, all this national press coverage, does also rile some local feathers. The Kearney Hub leads the recovery expedition, for all of this material, gets a lot of their stories into national press, but the balloon didn't crash in Kearney. The balloon also didn't crash in Holdridge. The balloon crashed in Loomis, which the folks in Loomis really want to remind the world and this is that damned balloon, but that's not how they write it in the paper. It's still falling all over the country the last time it fell around Kearney. And then Loomis is still asking the credit be given or credit is due. We've been a dot on the map 10 miles west of Holdridge. So there is quite a bit of irritation that all of this attention is being devoted to the crash site and to this expedition and what it means, but they are, the press reports are coming out of Kearney, the press reports are coming out of Holdridge. This balloon is landing all over the countryside, but it's not landing where it was. There's also support. There's some criticism that this was a waste of money, a waste of taxpayer resources, all these different things. But the Kearney Hub actually goes out and defends the expedition. That ultimately, yeah, it failed. It was a failure. But it's a necessary step, right, in scientific progress. That you're going to have failed experiments. You're going to have failed expeditions, and that you learn from those mistakes and you try and try again. And that, this problem solving, this effort to penetrate the mysteries of the elements. You don't kind of see explorations of the mysteries of the elements in columns of the hub anymore. That it's in the American experience upon which the nation is founded and has prospered. This is ultimately an American endeavor. It's an intellectual endeavor, it's a scientific endeavor, and it's also about bravery and courage to go into a 700-pound magnesium alloy ball and go, into the stratosphere and survive, right? There's something innately American about it, and they do achieve some scientific breakthroughs on this. This is the stratograph. This is the only surviving instrument. You can see that they have found it. They actually have to kind of scour the countryside because they drop it off at some point and it kind of floats away, but they do have some data to bring back. And then the photo on right, which today when you can go on your phone and you can look at satellite imagery to plot out, a travel trip through like Google Maps, the thought of an aerial photo, this is the highest aerial photo up to this point in time. The taking a photo of the landscape from that high up. No one has looked at the earth from this high up, right, and taken a photograph and returned. And so this is an incredible kind of artifact in the history of satellite photography, of photography in general, and what they are actually able to accomplish on this. And they have this investigation, they learn more about it, and the crew arrives at the National Geographic Society with their parachutes, because that is what saved them. They receive commendations from the National Geographic Society. General John J. Pershing provides them medals under the auspices of the National Geographic Society. They meet Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and as any good scientist does, they immediately begin preparing the second expedition. They have a set of data, they have learned their lessons, and they ultimately then are successful with Explorer 2.
As night falls in the Black Hills of South Dakota, the United States National Geographic balloon is inflated for its now historic flight into space. 0 hour for a great adventure, with Captain Stevens and Captain Anderson as the men of the hour. At the command upship, she is cut loose and rises swiftly, carrying the two intrepid sky explorers into the unknown. The vast void that is the home of the cosmic ray, higher than man has ever gone, with a new altitude record of over 72,000 feet. When the radio stations get the message that the balloon is coming down, the Pathé News plane is right on the job, with these pictures showing the actual landing. See the bag flattening out as the last of the helium escapes. Deflated after landing, the gondola and its recording instruments uninjured, Stevens and Anderson are safe and sound. Well done, conquerors of the Strat.
So they do make it. The second expedition is much more successful. They also cut it back to a two-man crew. Major Kepner, who had led the first expedition, does not participate in this second flight. And so there's no wreckage for this one. The whole thing survives, and this is now at the Air and Space Museum. And you can see the cramped conditions that they're in, and then the amount of ballast that they've got surrounding their aircraft that ultimately does take them to 72,000 feet in the air. And so this is kind of an interesting moment in the history of the space race and Central Nebraska. We don't think of ourselves necessarily as being a pivotal place. We are not Cape Canaveral. We are not the Johnson Space Center in Houston. We are not Kitty Hawk, but we are nevertheless the site of an important failure and an important lesson in the history of aviation. And it was something that the community was very deeply involved in the recovery efforts, in the initial light petty larceny that probably, I don't know what exactly it would be, stealing materials from a crash site. But it provides, in this moment in the Great Depression, it provided this hope, this possibility, and this potential, and it demonstrated the local community's effort in supporting greater achievements than themselves at a very important time. And usually with these, I want to immediately end and discuss questions, but I also want to end with an invitation. We are going to be celebrating the 90th anniversary of the crash on June 28th in Holdridge. And we're gonna have representatives from the United States Air Force and others. We're also gonna be, we're very happy, we are gonna have the last known witness to the crash with us. At this event, we're gonna have some of the wreckage that is at the museum on display, and kind of other materials that are related to the crash site. We have some oral histories at the museum that were taken a number of years ago with other witnesses who are no longer with us. And so we're gonna have a lot of this material on display, and then we're gonna launch a weather balloon that will eventually crash, but thankfully nobody's gonna be on board. And so with that, questions?
In a balloon itself, it wasn't just.
Yeah, so there's like a balloon, and then there's an envelope that kind of descends around it.
Oh, it's tighter, it's inside that envelope.
Yeah.
Was there an explosion then with this?
Yeah, the hydrogen, the oxygen and the hydrogen do mix, and they do explode.
So there was some kind of a spark that set it off, or?
Yeah, just a really volatile mixture, and it could have been static electricity from. I don't think the cause of the explosion is.
So was that little?
So yeah, so you've got a balloon here, and then you've got an envelope over it. Because as the balloon goes up and down, it changes in size as the density of the gases change, and so it's this large at atmosphere, and then as you get higher, it's much smaller as stuff.
So was that little gondola pressurized, or that little ball?
Yeah, it does have an atmosphere in it, but it's not pressurized like an airplane today. They've got oxygen in it, but as far as I know, I don't think there's, it's not kept in a ground atmosphere like an airplane
So
would be.
you said a lot of the Russian ones all died. Was that because they got the bends because of?
No, they died because their balloon exploded and they couldn't get out of the gondola in time. The G-forces were too much, and so they just hit on impact. They were falling for a much longer distance and became unconscious and then just died. The pressure just knocked them out.
So at 70-some thousand feet, was there, well, like a diver goes on, did they have the bends because of oxygen? Was that a factor of any kind, or what?
It was, no, I mean, the pressure, you have a lessening of the pressure, just this high now, they're cold.
Apparently didn't affect them.
Yeah, they were fine. Yeah, there was cold. Probably some burst blood vessels.
The one thing I noted on that photograph on the farmer, it was July 28th. Wasn't a lot of corn growing.
No,
there,
there's
was
nothing
there?
in the field, that's the thing. I think, and they talk about that, right? Like, I think that, I don't.
It was 1934, but they had big ridges, so they must have been irrigating.
They tried to plant, but there was nothing.
Yeah, so there's nothing,
all
yeah,
those big
there's
ridges?
nothing.
Yeah.
Like they were irrigating with water, gravity flow from the Holdridge system, but I don't see a lot of corn there.
Yeah.
Was there a fire when it exploded on the ground? Or
No, it explodes at 5,000 feet, and then the gases, I mean, they burn off, and so when it hits the ground.
But looking at the crowd in the back, the fashion they wear, the dress heights, but I still don't see any corn.
No, thankfully he doesn't have, this is also depression, dust bowl. I mean, he might not have been wanting to put anything in, or is taking, subsidy to not put anything in. That would be a question. I think there might be some descendants who own that property still. I'm not 100% sure. That's a question for the Holdridge Museum.
Question to have answered.
Do you have some idea of the timeline from when they lifted off to when they crashed? How
Yeah,
long
so
were there?
they lift off at 5:45 a.m. and they hit later that afternoon.
Oh, so they were in the air quite a while.
Yeah, because they're at about kind of northern Nebraska. They're south of Niobrara about 11:40. I think it's early afternoon when they hit the field. I don't have the exact time.
Right there, back up. See that field behind that guy like he's swatting a mosquito? I don't see a lot growing, do you?
Yeah, no, it's
Kind of bleak.
34. It's
That's cool.
nasty. Yeah, no.
comments.
Mhm.
Always interested in the people that were going up before them.
Mhm.
And one of them was a J. Picard,
Mhm.
Jacques Picard, the commander of the Enterprise.
No, unfortunately not.
I know.
Unfortunately, it's not
It's
Jean-Luc.
it's interesting that they used that name.
It's not Jean-Luc, it's the brother of August.
There's
Or
a
it's,
Mr. and Mrs.
yeah, it's August and his wife, and,
There's
or no,
Mrs.
August, and then it's August's brother and his wife.
and J. Picard,
Yeah.
which is interesting.
It's the three of them.
The interesting thing to me is my father was one of those people viewing that,
Mm-hmm.
and he never talked to me about it directly, but our farm is just about 10 miles north and west of there.
Mhm.
And I did not know until today that Florence Yoder was there, who is another relative of mine.
Mhm.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
But he did collect some of those strips.
Mhm.
He did mail them back to
Mhm.
Geographic, and they sent him back a nice letter and returned the strips to him.
Mhm.
He had been a member of the Geographic since 1929. He was 24 when, or 29 when that happened.
Mhm.
And was a member of Geographic until he died, so we had the Geographic from 1929 on,
Mhm.
and the farm from about 130 years.
Wow.
So he was there as a witness to that and was very interested in it, very scientifically interested, and I have that letter, which I've been desperately trying to find for the last 2 days. I will find it, and if you would like it, or if we need
Oh,
to take
yeah,
it
we
to,
can- yeah.
I'd like to donate that back now, because
Thank
it's
you.
more important to them than it is to us now.
Yeah,
But,
it was quite a feat, and that kind of public engagement, like involving them as kind of citizen scientists
Yeah.
as part of it is just, I think, one of the neater aspects of this.
Yeah.
If you were a member of the National Geographic Society when the second expedition went up, they sent you a bookmark made out of the envelope of the second balloon. And so those are quite collector's items now, because they're printed with the Explorer 2 balloon on it, made out of the fabric of the
I'd vote
successful.
For that too.
Yeah, yeah.
That was-
Where was the first one supposed to land, and where did the second one
They
land?
didn't have, I mean, they had spotter planes and they were following it on the radio. Prevailing wind conditions, they knew it would probably be somewhere in Nebraska, vaguely. But kind of with ballooning today, you know, you kind of have crews that are following you, depending on things that might happen. The second expedition just goes up and comes back down in South Dakota.
So how do they successfully land it? Can they drain that hydrogen out? So
Yeah,
they-
there's a, let's look at the diagram again. I've had to learn way too much about ballooning. There's a rip panel up here, right here, the rip panel cord, and so you can, and there's a long rope, and so you can pull that and open up a little bit on the top and drain out some of the lighter than air gas, in this case hydrogen, helium for the second expedition, because helium doesn't explode. And eventually begin to descend that way. Yeah. And it's miles and miles of rope. I think it's 3.5 miles of rope. I mean, it's a lot of, there's a lot up there. It's a lot like sailing. I mean, 'cause you've got different things you can do for direction and other kinds of things up there.
You said the balloon decreased in size
Mhm.
as it goes up?
Mhm. Yeah, so if you look at it in photos here, it's more spherical, right? And then you've got the envelope kind of dangling around the sides. That looks more like a balloon. And same here, but then as you get higher and higher, well, that's not it gets elongated.
Like
As
the
the,
drawing
as the,
shows.
yeah, as the balloon condenses in size up at the top.
What makes it decrease in size? I would think with
Lesser
lesser
Mhm.
pressure would expand.
Yeah, that's beyond my capabilities as a historian. That's not-
Good answer.
The third pilot from the first one who didn't go on the second one, did he opt out or was he kind of forced out?
I don't remember, why Major Kepner chooses not to do it. I don't remember. I've not really looked looked at the Explorer too. It's not as exciting. I mean, it goes up and it comes down. It's just not as exciting. But all three of these men provided kind of recollections about these expeditions. Captain Stevens, his wife, wrote a biography of him later in life. Major Keppner collaborated with the historian on some recollections, and then Captain Anderson also did. And they all continued. I think they all end up like becoming generals in the Army, Air Corps, later Air Force. And I believe it's Major Keppner actually is at the launch of Apollo 11. I mean, so for like aviation people, these people are all big deals, kind of in the history of the space race and everything. So even in the 50s and 60s, they're kind of recognized as pioneers, and consequently, like, are invited to things like the launch of Apollo 11. Whereas today we have a lot of astronauts, so the balloonists aren't as exciting. We go well beyond the stratosphere today. Well, thank you all.